It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, Quiller Nation, and as always, thank you so much for being here and joining us for Don't Quill the Messenger. My special guest today comes to us all the way from jolly old England. His name is David Roper. He's a mathematician, a scientist, an author, and a Shakespeare authorship super sleuth. David, welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger.
Well, thank you very much.
Now, you studied mathematics, statistics, and philosophy, so you're a wide-ranging guy. You also have a very interesting history when you worked as a managing accountant for a company on the London Stock Exchange. So you come to us from a background that isn't very common when it comes to authorship super sleuths. But after obtaining your honors degree, you became the head of mathematics at North London College, and you started publishing papers about Shakespeare. How does a mathematician suddenly get involved in the greatest literary mystery of all time?
Well, being English, we hear a lot about Shakespeare, and right from childhood, I had an interest in him, particularly when I saw his writing. It disappointed me. I was only about 10 at the time, and we were given a book on Shakespeare, and we saw his signature, and it looked like the sort of signature we would make when we were learning to write. So from that time on, it was always on the back of my mind, and people came along and they said, oh, Bacon wrote it and Bacon didn't write it. In the meantime, I was doubtful, but I didn't have an opinion. But what I liked was when John Rollitt, much later, of course, he was probably remembered for what he did on the sonnets. He found this name of the fellow of Southampton and Risley, and I got to hear about it, and I thought that was interesting. I would have a look myself, and we spoke on the phone, John and myself, and I got the impression that there might be something more there. John was hoping that I might join him in looking for beer. He couldn't find beer. He'd been searching for it. But I got the idea, as a mathematician, you might say, that there was a way of getting at it by a code that had been discovered in the 16th century by Geronimo Cardano. And I got a way of actually finding out by using a crib, as they call it, and using alternate numbers on the letters underneath the bust of Shakespeare up in Stratford-on-Avon, where I write it out, then there's a way of doing it, actually, by looking for alternate numbers. Because if you have a crib and you know the name Vera or Bacon or Marlowe, you can then look for M and A and the sort of skips between them. And sure enough, one evening, I think it was back in the 1990s, one evening I had not much work to do, and I found the key, you might say. And from then on, it's been sort of finding out more and more about it. I didn't find everything at once, but I found enough beer and some other words about it from Ben Jonson. I think I got his initials on it. And then I joined the English version of Shakespeare, Beer, and I did a talk at one of their meetings, and it went down quite well. And from then on, I started to get letters asking me to have a look at their work. And I improved on it, you might say, to an extent when I could be absolutely certain beyond all doubt, to be honest, that Shakespeare definitely was Edward de Vere, and no doubt about it.
Well, and you wrote a paper that was published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration in December of 2017, and that led to you then creating your book. You have many books. We'll talk about several of them, but the most important one probably is the book that's titled "How Science Proved Edward de Vere Was William Shakespeare." And there's been a very recent a publication of the Journal of Scientific Exploration devoted to this topic. And I noticed that several of the contributors to this most recent edition cite your work. They refer to you, they give you credit for having kind of crashed open the door, and you certainly crashed open the door for that publication to give this subject some print back in 2017, more than 6 years ago, or around 6 years ago. But tell me a little bit about the contents of your book that led from that paper, and how science actually is involved in your super sleuthing on this mystery.
Right. Well, once I knew about Edward de Vere, and he was in fact Shakespeare, I could then look up the other work that people had done. Quite a lot of it, to be honest. Some of it I didn't agree with. I thought it was not enough evidence, but I was able to put together the reality of what actually happened for him to be sort of cast aside, because he was very popular with Elizabeth. He was at Elizabeth I, and I thought that there was something missing. And then I realized exactly what it was. He was the son-in-law of Lord Burleigh, as you all know, and he was a disappointment to him. He'd been apparently when his father died, he was made guardian. Lord Burleigh was Oxford's guardian, and they grew apart. But of course, he went on to marry Burleigh's daughter. They had several children, but Burleigh was not in favour of him. He didn't like poetry much, to my mind, anyway, from what I could gather. And that led me to look more deeply into it. And basically what it is, it's everyone loves his plays, but the sonnets, I love as well, but they never got much publicity at the time. In fact, when they were published, they were immediately withdrawn. So there must be something about them. And what it was, I think, was their homoerotic content about his enjoyment or liking for another man. And Burleigh, of course, would be horrified. He was favoured by Elizabeth I, counsellor, and Burleigh wanted to silence him because of he was thinking of his grandchildren. He was thinking of the threat to the throne, even, and there were these reasons. So what he did was really fantastic. He got someone else to be the author, and that really was the story behind it. This man, Shakespeare, who'd come up from Stratford-on-Avon and was seen as rather clever, but the fact that he'd come up from Stratford-on-Avon meant that it was about 3 days' ride from London. And when he was approached, as I assume he was, because he suddenly got a lot of money from nowhere, you might say, and he took on this task of pretending to be Shakespeare. Now, what would Oxford do? He probably didn't do it willingly, but he agreed to remain quiet about it, and he got some friends together, I'm thinking of Tom Nash, and he would have known about Spencer as well. Anyway, I had to speak to them to keep quiet about it, because you'll find that nobody really ever, in London anyway, accepted him as Shakespeare. That was really behind, what I concluded. And I built the case up from then with more and more information that I could get from that theory. And it seemed to stick. It answered all the questions that people ask about it. Now, what does the science do about it? Well, it's very simple, that the science has to rely upon the probability of grills coming together, the grills being the Cardano grills. And then I found out more and more of the contemporaries of Oxford had been writing their work in such a way that these grills, or Cardano grills, can be formed. And they've all had something in common. They all had the word rune, R-U-N-E, which was an old German word meaning silence, whisper in secret. And that the fact that they were all using that word was just an extra reason why these grills were true. The recognition that Edward de Vere was Oxford, I think, had rankled particularly with Ben Jonson, and he seems to be the person behind it. He did a little one on the first folio by using rune in its old way. I think he was frightened, actually, because of he didn't want to be found out, but at the same time he wanted to recognize that things were not as they seemed to be. And then, of course, there was if you look even deeper, what do you see? You see all the people who knew the secret close to Shakespeare, they all died, one way or the other. When Ben Jonson started writing, editing, I would say, the work, Shakespeare, he dies. The story about it in Stratford-on-Avon is that he was visited by Ben Jonson and somebody else, and then he died. They fell ill the next day. Then there was his wife, who died for reasons we don't know, just before the first folio was published. There was the forced marriage of Judith, so that she wouldn't fall under the same fate, in trying to get her married so that she'd be covered by what was called the coverture of the husband. The other daughter, Susanna, she already had a husband, and apparently he knew the secret because he went to London with Shakespeare much later on, sometime when Shakespeare was buying this new house in London. So he knew, and he could be, it was obviously promised to keep quiet about it. And London, of course, absolutely silent when Shakespeare died, and everything fits together, whichever way you look. But the science of it is the probabilities. We start working out what is the probability of 11 grills, all of them containing rune and beer together. And it becomes an enormous probability that it was by chance.
This incredible way of looking at this mystery. I'm really intrigued by the fact that you have obviously a belief system that includes that the man Shakespeare from Stratford was involved in this ruse, that he was part of the cover story. And I think you're one of the first people that I've talked to that has indicated some sort of an idea that there were others who were silenced on that side of the fence, the Shakespeare Stratford side.
Yeah.
And I've never heard anyone theorize that part of that silencing may have included the murders or secret murders of people who they didn't want to know and didn't want to have loose ends out there who might talk about it, including the Stratford man himself. That's a very interesting theory. But I do find it very intriguing that you talk about the mathematical probability of much of the evidence and the number of times we see these references in the works of other contemporaries. And I never looked at the word rune the same way as you just pointed out. And I think that it's incredible because one of the things, I think one of the big things that modern scholars in this field forget to analyze is the meanings of words from different languages. And what we tend to gloss over is the fact that this writer had to have been fluent in multiple languages. So he understood word origins and word meanings. And his contemporaries also spoke multiple languages and understood word origins and word meanings at a far greater level than we English speakers can possibly analyze and understand without looking into these other languages. And you almost need to be a linguist and versed in at least Italian and French and Greek in order to truly dive into and understand the works and where the words are coming from and what their meanings are.
Well, I was fortunate there. At school we had to do Latin and French, so I was somewhat helped by it, a great help by it. But with the question of deaths, as a mathematician, we don't normally believe in coincidences, and the coincidences are there. Shakespeare died just about the time that Ben Jonson started doing his editing, which would have taken him some years to find all of the things together, put all of that together for the first folio. Then, of course, just before it was published, his wife dies. Well, that's a bit of a coincidence. Now, I know that he had two daughters, and one of them, as I said, was married to John Hall, who's a doctor, who knew about it because he was gone off to London with Shakespeare. But the other one, Gwyneth, was Judith. She didn't, I think she really wanted to marry, but she got palmed off with someone while he was writing his will. And I think the fact that he was writing his will and he actually says that he was in good health, God be praised, tends to, if you put it all together, he was being pressured into writing his will because they wanted to publish Shakespeare's books in the first folio, his plays. And then, of course, he had a brother. His brother also died quite unexpectedly. Then, much later, when they wanted to publish the sonnets, his two grandsons, they died just before it was published. Both of them, no reason why, but that was it. Every time something was going to be published or getting ready for it, the person people who knew him just died.
That is a very interesting sequence of events, and I don't know that anyone has ever actually pointed that out to me. And I find that very intriguing as another layer of this mystery. I always felt that I wasn't sure that the Stratford man even knew he was going to be remembered in history as having anything to do with these plays. But what you're indicating is that he definitely
he kept
knew.
Quiet about it. He was told to keep quiet about it. I think what was happening was that when he came to London, he had to do something to earn some money, and he was looked after horses, basically, while the people who went into theatre who had horses and they wanted them to be looked after. And he did that for a time. And then he got noticed by the people inside, the players inside there. They probably got together, as people do. And they invited him in as an odd job man, which he did. He came in. And then, of course, when De Vere was looking for someone to take his place, this came after the Venus and Adonis and the Red Lucrece, because Shakespeare was never heard about until long after that. And I think it was a time that De Vere thought that Shakespeare, coming from Stratford-on-Avon, was the right person. I think he was a very bright person. He wasn't stupid, but he wasn't educated. I think he really couldn't read or write properly. But nevertheless, I don't think it mattered to De Vere. He just wanted someone there that he could name. And it grew from that rather badly, because much later, Mears comes along and he writes about marvelous things about Shakespeare, what he can do, what he can't do, everything's there. And that was about the end of the 1590s. So that was, I think, the time when things really got serious. Before, you've never heard of Shakespeare. From the time of the two major poems, you don't hear about him anymore. Then that's when he becomes rather rich and goes back to Stratford-on-Avon and buys the second best house in the county. So again, it fits together rather nicely. I mean, if there's anything there that doesn't, I can quite look at it. But I think everything fits. And then, of course, you get the next thing. He's got this affair with Lord Southampton, the third Earl of Southampton. And Burghley must have been really embarrassed by it, because he was only 16 years old when all these sonnets were written, which showed Oxford being rather taken in a way that perhaps would be doubtful in those days. And from then, I think Burghley had to do something about it, which, of course, was making Shakespeare, as we call him, the person that he came to be. I think it was Bill Bryson who said it was like an electron, ever here but never there, to use scientific language on that.
Sure. That's a fun way of describing it. I like that, especially coming from someone with your background. You've done a lot of work on the inscription on the monument in Stratford-upon-Avon.
That's a beauty, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned the monument. You mentioned the gravestone beneath the monument. Explain to us some of the contents of your book that involve that particular very touristy, very attractive location that people love to visit whenever they go to England.
Well, of course, it is a lovely beauty spot there, and I have obviously been there to see it for myself. What is so lovely about about Shakespeare is that it is written in what we call ciphertext. That means that it has been prepared. Now, the preparation, when you really look into it, is that it's difficult to do. You've got to get letters evenly spaced to make a word, and that is very difficult. In fact, you can't do it without showing that there is differences that you make. And I mentioned, I think, in the work that I've done, that there are 7 anomalies there which shouldn't be there. I think, well, I had mentioned them. They were the word German is there that shouldn't be there, SIEH, which means look, and that's so there so that Ben Jonson's I can be there, and he can be M and D E, that may be Ben Jonson. Then you get the different spellings. The author of that piece of work writes that in open words, THAT. He writes T, then YT, then he changes this to YS, and then he writes the Stratford Monument round the wrong way. So you've got Monument Stratford, which one shouldn't really do, unnecessary. And if you put them together, there's 7 of them, and when you write it all out, you can see why all of those 7 had to be different, otherwise it wouldn't be there. But what also is interesting is the key. It was Dr. Bruce Spittle from New Zealand who drew attention to the fact that the last line in the Latin words above that have 35 characters, or they should have 35 characters, but they were reduced to 34 by one of the words with the A&E joined, and that made it 34. Now, 34 is two 17s, so along the bottom, you get the length of the wording there as 17 plus 17. And then, of course, you need more keys. Now, this is very interesting because you must have keys, in other words, to make it real. Now, the first word was what is it? It was beer, actually. And I'm just trying to the word area. Perfecto. Now, perfecto is a marvelous Latin word because if you look it up, it tells you it means recently, certainly and really. Now, if you look up beer in the same dictionary, you've got the same definition, certainly and really. So they are synonyms. So when Johnson, as it indeed must have been, he wrote perfecto, he was also writing beer. And then you begin to be downward the vertical wording of what's called the plain text. The plain text is the grammatical secret that's being held. Then, of course, the next word along there, the next key is the Latin word for 17, and then you get the translation for the third one, 17. The point is that they all point three ways. They all point to clusters. Clusters are a giveaway. It means if you've got a cluster, it's probably not there by coincidence. And if you get three of them, and with their code words at the top, perfecto, and the Latin word for 17, and then the English translation, then, of course, everything falls into place. And you can read the whole thing, which is what I wrote there, which basically, so testing, I vow, is, and then whisper in secret because of rune. Whisper in secret. Then, I don't think that concept. Yeah. Then we got De Vere as E. Shakespeare. And then last thing I discovered was scamp. And that was unexpected because he called Shakespeare a scamp. Only by code, but again, by these alternate words going from one letter to the other. And I cannot see that any single person could say that was there by chance. In fact, going back to the 1990s when someone else had looked at it, and he was a Shakespeare man. He didn't believe at all in beer. He said he was going to spend the whole of his summer holiday looking at gravestones to show that it wasn't there by design, that he could do better by looking at gravestones. Never heard of him again. So no one has ever challenged that particular giveaway, that cryptogram, which it really is. And then, of course, the doggerel verse underneath, I thought that must be connected. And sure enough, it was.
That's an incredible discovery. And when you look at it with the perspective of Ben Jonson being so clever. I mean, a lot of these guys who were writing, in your work, you mentioned Edwin Spencer's work. You mentioned Thomas Nash. You mentioned Thomas Thorpe, Leonard Diggs,
that's right.
John Benson. You go through a list of people who were at some point in their discoveries of their own writing. At some point in their own writing, they were pointing to Edward de Vere. They were pointing to the 17th Earl of Oxford and letting people know. They felt it important enough. They were aware that this man had been stifled in this way, that there had been an attempt to sort of erase him and his work from history. And they felt that it was important enough to leave these clues to point to this man. And I think it demonstrates the intense love for the quality of his work. And I think that that's an important element to solving this mystery that we don't see when we try to attribute the work to the Stratford man, who was basically ignored, forgotten, and nobody gave a hoot about him, his life, or his death, most importantly, as he lived and died in Stratford upon Avon.
This, in fact, is, you have hit the point. Yeah, I think I was trying to think of the first time it came up. Who thought of it first? And I think it came about when De Vere was asked to write The Merry Wives of Windsor. And he went down to Wilton House, and I think he took Thomas Nash with him. I'm pretty sure he did. And the result was that Nash obviously knew this because he writes on the sonnet in which in which De Vere actually admits that he is the poet De Vere, although that was actually found by Dr. Ferris, I think it was from the US, who wrote to me and said he found Vere on sonnet number, I think it was 79. And I looked at it and agreed with him, and we had a nice conversation. But then I found out there was much more to it than Dr. Ferris had said. For example, De Vere puts his name right in between my name and my argument, which it should do. And then, of course, I wonder whether Tom Nash had anything to do with it. And sure enough, by using the alternate letters, it says I.T. Nash, all spelt properly, and he uses his own word for rune as well. So 2 runes and 2 men on sonnet number 79, I think it was 79. And I think that was the first time that it came about, and that would have been perhaps the 15, when The Merry Wives of Windsor was actually first shown for Elizabeth. I can't remember the date, to be honest. That's when it was done. And then others took up to it. I mean, Tom Nash did it on his own work. Right at the very beginning. That's another thing they do. When they do those things, whoever does it always does it right at the beginning of one of their works, and it's one of the works that they think will probably last time, go through time, and not get destroyed. And you do find that. I think looking at it was Edward Spencer's, for example. It's right at the beginning of the Fairy Queen. And Thomas Nash, again, it's his epistle in Strange News, again, right at the beginning. Leonard Biggs, another one, right at the beginning. So there's a system to it. The more you look at it, the more obvious it is.
Another part of your research and work involves a play of Shakespeare's that happens to be one of my favorites that I talk about quite often, and it's Titus Andronicus. And you've done a lot of study on that play, and you believe, as I believe, that it is not an early work of Juvenilia, but actually a later work of Edward de Vere's, and that it involved him, I believe it's him showing off his knowledge of Greek allusion. And it is a very important and pointed play with some very deep messages. It is not just a bloody revenge tragedy. I think it has a lot deeper meaning than that. And I'm curious about what drew you to do work on that particular play that so many people tend to shy away from and not even want to mention or address because of its bloody nature.
Now that one, of course, it did get a lot of attention over in America, and I got invited over there actually to give a talk on it. I'm just trying to think why it was, what it was that I saw about it. You caught me out there because it goes. I have to think, looking back in time now. What was it that I saw there?
Well, one of the things that you
I
point
think
out
that-
is that you point out that you believe that it was written in the 1570s. I
Oh
recently
yeah.
took a trip to Italy, and a lot of people are very
Yeah.
aware that Edward de Vere traveled Italy very extensively, and it was later in his travels, near the end of his travels, after he leaves Siena, he heads south, and he ends up in Sicily. And we don't know for a fact because his letters don't come to us from past Siena to Sicily, but we have to, I believe, we have no choice but to imagine that based on his travels, he then must have passed through Rome to get to the south to then travel across to Sicily. And in recently having been in Rome and having been at what is left of the Roman Forum, one of the interesting things that I discovered is on the front end of the Roman Forum, there is an arch, a very beautiful triumphal arch that was created and depicts the successes and the conquests of the Roman Emperor Titus. On the opposite end of the Forum, there is the remains of what used to be a temple to Saturn. And it struck me immediately that here in these ancient ruins, which would have been standing there the same as they stand there right now, would have been standing there in the 1570s when Edward was passing through. These ancient ruins of the Roman Forum have these two characters juxtaposed from each other on either ends, Titus and Saturn. And then in Titus Andronicus, we have this conflict between Titus and Saturninus. And I thought to myself as I stood there, he was here, he stood here, he saw this, and it became part of his impetus for those characters and for using those names in his play, which then means that the play had to have been written after he traveled to Italy and not before, if I'm right in that connection.
Well, I can't argue with anything that you have said, but I don't see it that way. While you were talking, it suddenly came back in my mind exactly why I wrote what I did. And it was because I did not agree with the way the Stratfordians had deciphered the date on the I'm talking now about that piece of what was that? There was something. Where was I? Yeah, everyone has their own, over here on Stratford. They had their own idea of what Peacham meant when he wrote the part of what he did. We wrote the date. That was it, the date. And I did not agree with any of them, and I went about it my own way. And I came up with the date that I had, which we presumably got before you. It makes it possible. And I went from there, and that's coming back to me now. I went from there to Hertfordshire and to see where Peacham actually. I'm talking now about Peacham, the father, not the son.
Mm-hmm.
The father was the priest over in Hertfordshire, and he has there a tablet in the church to the will that he left to posterity, in which he gives up all his lands. That's just beside the point. But what I'm getting at is that it was exactly next to where Elizabeth I had her house, and he being the vicar of the locality, he would have been invited to any meetings, general meetings, a theatre, for example, in which there was a. I'm trying to get out of there was a play there. My memory coming back to me. There was a play there done, and we don't know what it was, but it could have been. It could have been Titus Andronicus, because he gave a picture of it, the one that you must be familiar with, to who did he gave it to? Oh, he gave it to the secretary of Lord Burleigh, and to me, that was why I got involved in it. Why do I believe that? Because beforehand, De Vere had no practical knowledge of the Renaissance and what was going on in Italy, which is why I probably wanted to go there. And he was writing, so earlier scholars have said, who believed that Oxford was right in place, that he only had those sort of old ones to go by. So De Vere would have been reading the Greek and the Latin classics, and they were sort of plays that Titus Andronicus is in the same sort of genre. And when he went to Italy, he changed because he had learned what was modern. And that's why I disagree with you. Basically, because of that picture that he gave to Burleigh's secretary with the date on it, and the Stratfordians tried to make it late, but it isn't. I stick by what I did.
Well, and one of the things
disagree a bit on that, but I can't prove it anymore. That's it.
One of the things that you point out, and even regardless of whether, one of the dates that you point to is 1575, which would have been earlier than Edward's trip through Italy. I'm saying that it had to be sometime in 1578 or 1579 after his trip to Italy. Nonetheless, at that time, the Stratford man would have been between the ages of 10 and 14 years old. And so regardless of which one of us is correct, it's what we are both proving is that it's impossible that the Stratford man could have written Titus Andronicus at any age, let alone the age of between 10 and 14 years old.
Yeah, no, but absolutely, yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And that was, of course, one of the reasons why I published it in the papers that I did. I did one for the Vere Society over here in London.
I want to take a few minutes to talk about some of your other works. I want to make sure the listeners know the book we've been talking about, fellow Quillers, is How Science Proved Edward de Vere Was William Shakespeare. You can find that anywhere books are sold, but you can also find references to David's work at his website. It is davidroper.eu. That's David Roper, ROPER. .eu, and not only will you find his book on the mathematical equations that prove that Edward de Vere is Shakespeare, but you'll also find a few other books that David has written, including Proving Shakespeare in Ben Jonson's Own Words and Shakespeare to Be or Not to Be. One thing to know about you, David, that I found very intriguing in your history is that your discovery with regards to, and I know this is going to be way in the weeds for my listeners, but it's important to note that your discovery on the property of binomial theorem involving prime numbers that sort of changed the world of math as we know it, from dating all the way back to Pierre de Fermat and Sir Andrew Wiles. And you have an incredible brain, my friend. The things that you can think about and do with your mind astound me, because I've never been good at math, and you have made these major mathematical discoveries in your history. And I just think that that's an important aspect to bring to the discussion, because it demonstrates where your brain is coming from with regards to this mystery.
Well, the Fermat, I did try to get it published, but no one listens to me. So I'm going to see that it's going to be published later this year with full details, so everyone can check the math themselves.
And you're also working on, you've already published one volume of what you describe as going to be a 2-volume edition of a book called The Mind of God. Tell me a little bit about that. That's a very interesting title, I think, and very intriguing. How does one write about the mind of God?
Well, again, it is a mathematics. That book, by the way, is going to be replaced also, hopefully, before Christmas, because I had rewritten it in a different way. Why? Let's put it this way. I get inspired by certain things and they work out true. And if I work on them, if you know anything about, well, how can I put this? When you look at the musicians, I'm talking about the classical musicians, they get inspired by a theme and then they work on it and they develop a piece of music. A bit like them, but not musical. I get inspired by an idea, and I work on it, and it proves to be right. I can't put it any other way. So with ephemera, I knew what it ought to be by inspiration, and I had to work very hard and long, and it's difficult to find out, to expand on it and develop it. And that's what I did. And with the Shakespeare, I also had the same idea, although I think perhaps John Rollitt might have had some work in it, because he gave me the idea of looking at, he called it, he didn't call it Cardano Grill, he called it something else, I can't remember now. But I thought, well, there must be something mathematical about it, and I couldn't get it out of my head. And so I explored it one evening and found it was true. And I'm sorry, that's the only way to say it. Inspiration.
Well, no, it's incredible because I think it's important. I have a lot of guests that I've talked to on this program. My listeners are familiar with all of them. We've had more than 100 episodes. We're in fact approaching very quickly our 6th anniversary coming up of producing this series. And you're a very unique guest because your background is not in literature. Your background is in math and science, and you have approached this mystery from this very mathematical and scientific way, and it brings a unique perspective. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you here, and it's one of the reasons why I want to encourage my listeners to find your work at your website. Again, folks, that's davidroper.eu, and you can purchase David's books through Amazon or any other place where you can find books being sold. There are some links right on his website, and there's quite a collection of titles there. You can also look him up. There are some other David Ropers, so be careful. Make sure that you find the correct one.
Yeah, that is the point. That's a problem. So I've changed my name. And now be Leonard Roper.
Okay.
In future. Good.
That makes sense because there is another David L. Roper who is an author, and he's a theologian, however. So make sure when you type in, if you don't go directly to David's website, davidroper.eu, if you type him into a search engine, make sure you type David Roper Shakespeare, and that's the easiest way to find him.
Yeah.
I want to thank you, David, for taking the time with us today, all the way from England, to share your work and your ideas with our listeners. Ladies and gentlemen, before we wrap things up here, Quiller Nation, I do want to remind you that registration is open and the reservations are already coming in for our inaugural Quiller event at the world-famous Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis coming in April 2024. Some of the opportunities are limited to the first 50 people, so you'll want to make sure you register now to avoid missing out. If you haven't received the info, then you need to join our subscriber list, which you can do from the homepage of our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. Just click on the little subscribe link there, follow the instructions, and you will get informed of all things Quiller in nature by receiving our monthly newsletter. And remember, we never will spam you, and we don't share our list with anyone. So go to the website, click subscribe, and you can join the newsletter list and receive all the information. An episode will be coming very soon to share more details about the event, but you can find the current information by visiting monumentalshakespeare.com. Monumentalshakespeare.com is where you will find the details about this monumental Shakespearean event in April 2024. Also, don't forget our special Quiller contest. Our exciting event will include a special marathon day of performances of 3 Shakespeare history plays back to back. Richard II, Henry IV, parts 1 and 2 combined, and Henry V. It's an entire day of Shakespeare presented by the same company of 25 professional actors at the world-famous Guthrie Theater, and it is part of our event in April. As part of that marathon package, we will be providing each marathon registrant with a handsome certificate and marathon medal to display with pride in commemoration of the day. These will be stamped in solid metal and attached to a stunning ribbon for display with the certificate, or to be worn on the breast of a shirt or the lapel of a jacket at your next authorship event. So this is a call to all of you graphic artists out there to help us design this marathon medal. If you're interested in designing this one-of-a-kind memorabilia collector's item, send your design ideas to me. Contact at don'tquillthepodcast.com. Contact at don'tquillthepodcast.com. The winning designer will be recognized at the event at the Guthrie and receive free registration for the events of the weekend. It's a circular medal, so keep that in mind when creating your design and send those creative ideas my way right away. In the meantime, make sure you watch your emails and our social media accounts for more details about everything Quiller in nature, and be sure to visit davidroper.eu for David's collection of works. And until next time, folks, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.